This evening we plunge into the harsh, the unpredictable, and the far less glamorous reality of the maritime exploration era. Leave behind the cinematic portrayals of daring adventurers and maps leading to treasure. What appears as a magnificent journey of discovery once reeked of pitch, seawater, and weary, hurting bodies. The reality is, it wasn't a sea monster or a buccaneer's artillery that most likely would have concluded your expedition. It was a quiet foe, one dwelling inside your very own flesh. So before settling in, pause to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate the content I create. And share in the comments your location and your current time. It's always intriguing to discover who's watching from across the globe. Now, lower the lights and let's begin this evening's exploration together. Long before it became a menace of the boundless ocean, this affliction was an age-old and close companion of humankind on solid ground. It was a sickness emerging from deprivation, though not always from hunger itself. It was a spectre that lurked at civilization's edges, a hushed epidemic that festered in locations where the Earth's natural rhythms were ignored or forbidden. Well before the maiden great vessel ventured into the unexplored, the condition was recognized, though poorly understood. It was documented by the careful observers of the classical era, individuals who noticed patterns in the misery surrounding them. Hippocrates in the 5th century before Christ witnessed the state among warriors on extended expeditions. He recorded a foulness in their breathing, a weakening of their gums, and bleeding beneath the leg skin. He documented the extreme weakness, the listlessness that overtook powerful warriors. However, he couldn't identify the source. He could merely chronicle the outcome, the gradual, unavoidable deterioration of the living form. The malady, which would eventually be termed scurvy, was a darkness that descended upon any settlement isolated from the Earth's fresh abundance. Picture a Roman legion stationed for a prolonged, difficult winter at the empire's very boundary, possibly along Hadrian's Wall, where winds sweep from the bleak north and terrain stays frozen for months. These were the most regimented, best provisioned soldiers in existence. Their supply systems were a wonder of their time. They possessed grain, countless vessels of wine and oil, and tons of preserved meat and fish to sustain them through winter. They weren't starving, yet as winter intensified, a peculiar malaise would settle across the garrison. It would start with a weariness in their bones, an exhaustion that rest couldn't remedy. Soldiers would report painful joints, their old battle injuries throbbing with phantom discomfort. Then tiny dark bruises would emerge on their shins as though from impacts they never sustained. Their gums would start to enlarge, becoming a dark bruised violet, the tissue becoming tender and sponge-like, bleeding at the slightest contact. A soldier might bite into a chunk of tough bread and discover a tooth had simply released, dropping from his mouth without discomfort, as though it were a loose stone. The garrison's medical facility would overflow with soldiers who weren't injured, not feverish, but were merely falling to pieces. The Roman physicians educated in Galen's methods would be confused. They might recommend bloodletting or possibly an adjustment in the humours, yet nothing succeeded. The soldiers were deteriorating despite full bellies, their bodies dissolving internally, all due to the absence of a basic green leaf or a bit of fresh fruit they couldn't obtain. This earthbound pattern recurred throughout history, becoming especially severe during the era of fortresses and blockades. A medieval town under siege was an ideal testing ground for this disease. When the attacking force encircled the walls, they severed the city from its lifeblood. The surrounding land, the fields, the orchards, the vegetable plots, all now lay in hostile territory. Within the fortifications, the grain storage might be abundant, the cellars stocked with salted meats and preserved fish. For a period, existence would persist. However, as weeks became months, the fresh provisions would disappear. The final apples and cabbages would be eaten, and the diet would reduce to the preserved and the dried. It was throughout the Crusades that this specific nightmare was recorded with severe precision. During the 5th Crusade, at the harsh year-and-a-half-long blockade of the Egyptian town of Damietta, starting in 1218, the Christian forces discovered themselves confined in their own encampments. Their supply routes stretched dangerously thin. The recorder Jacques de Vitry observed in terror as the sickness took control. He documented how the tissue on the soldiers' gums expanded so foul and bloated that it buried their teeth completely, becoming black and rotten. They couldn't consume food. The agony in their legs grew so excruciating that they cried out during sleep. Their skin turned spotted and dark as though they'd been assaulted. He depicted how the barbers, the surgeons of that period, would need to move through the camp with their blades, slicing away the dead. blackened tissue from the soldiers' mouths so they could take a bit of sustenance. This wasn't a quick, honorable death on the battlefield. This was a gradual, humiliating, and intensely personal breakdown. It was a sickness of separation, a consequence for arrogance, for armies and cities that thought they could maintain themselves on bread and salted pork by itself. This affliction was the land's silent retribution on those who had neglected it. It was a teaching delivered in garrisons, in blockaded cities, and in the frozen camps of wintering forces for thousands of years. However, the land was a merciful instructor. A blockade would ultimately conclude. A winter would ultimately end. An army would ultimately advance to a location where fresh provisions could be gathered. The remedy was constantly just beyond the horizon in the following valley in the approaching spring. The condition was dreadful, yet it was temporary. It hadn't yet discovered a location where there was no spring, no valley, no horizon. It hadn't yet discovered the sea, and it was on the merciless, barren vastness of the open ocean that this ancient condition would discover its genuine and dreadful domain. The beginning of the age of discovery in the late 15th century was a period of enormous human determination. New vessels, the caravel and carrack, were being constructed. Robust, deep-hulled ships capable of enduring the worst the Atlantic could unleash upon them. New navigation instruments, the astrolabe, the quadrant, the cross-staff permitted sailors to venture out of land's sight with newfound assurance. Humanity was prepared to sketch the final lines on the world's map. However, in their computations of wind, current, and stars, they had missed a vital variable. They understood how to construct ships that could resist the sea. However, they didn't understand how to construct a man who could. The fundamental character of a lengthy sea expedition established the ideal circumstances for this disease to thrive on an unparalleled magnitude. A ship was a blockaded city set adrift. For months, even years, its crew would be completely isolated from the land, and the provisions they carried with them were, through necessity, a diet of death. To endure for a journey of uncertain length, the food had to be indestructible. It had to be resistant to decay, insects, and moisture. The essentials of the sea were rock-solid biscuits called hardtack, baked months beforehand, and barrels upon barrels of salted meat, beef and pork, so saturated with brine that they were almost inedible, and dried peas. To drink, there was water stored in wooden barrels, where it rapidly grew slimy and rotten, and enormous quantities of beer or wine, which lasted better, yet offered no genuine nourishment. It was a diet completely lacking the one mysterious element that maintained the body intact. When Vasco da Gama departed from Lisbon in 1497 to discover a sea passage to India, his expedition was a success of navigation and a disaster of human health. His 4 tiny ships battled their path down Africa's coast and around the Cape of Good Hope, an achievement never previously accomplished. However, as they traversed the enormous empty span of the Indian Ocean, the ancient curse started its work. The crew grew listless. Their gums enlarged, their legs hurt. They perished one after another, their bodies sewn into their canvas hammocks with a concluding stitch through the nose, a severe tradition to guarantee the man was genuinely deceased and then thrown over the side. Of the men who voyaged with da Gama filled with dreams of spice and gold, merely 50 witnessed Portugal again. More than 2/3 of his crew had been consumed by the sea, not through drowning or violence, but through a quiet deterioration from within. The voyage was a triumph for the Portuguese crown, yet a devastating teaching in the genuine price of ocean travel. This disease, the mysterious sea plague, had announced itself as the principal barrier to empire. Yet, the teaching was not absorbed. The attraction of discovery was too powerful. And so, the great voyages persisted, and with each one this affliction was the silent, unlisted traveller. The most devastating testament to its strength came from the first circumnavigation of the planet. The expedition, headed by Ferdinand Magellan, which departed from Spain in 1519. It was the most daring voyage ever imagined, a journey into the absolute unknown. After navigating the treacherous straits at the tip of South America that would carry his name, Magellan sailed his fleet into an ocean so enormous and peaceful, he named it the Pacific. It was a dreadful misnomer. For the men on his ships, this peaceful sea was a blue wasteland, a liquid purgatory. They sailed for 99 days without glimpse of any land that could provide them relief. The expedition's recorder, an Italian nobleman named Antonio Pigafetta, maintained a thorough and dispassionate record of the terrors that developed. His account is not one of great adventure, yet of a gradual, grinding attrition. He documented, "We consumed biscuit, Yet in truth it was biscuit no more, but a powder filled with worms, for the worms had consumed its entire substance. It smelled of rat's urine, he continued. We drank water that was yellow and foul. We also consumed the ox hides that were beneath the mainyard, and frequently we consumed sawdust from boards. Rats were sold for half a ducat each, and even then we couldn't obtain them. Amid this starvation, the disease began its methodical harvest. Pigafetta depicted its symptoms with chilling accuracy. The greatest evil we endured, he documented, was in our gums, which expanded so greatly that they buried our teeth, and so the sick couldn't consume. He observed as 19 men perished, their bodies growing weaker day after day, their limbs swelling grotesquely. Another 30 were so ill they couldn't operate the ship. The vessels transformed into floating hospitals, then floating tombs. Healthy men had to step across the bodies of the dead and dying merely to perform their duties. The magnitude of the loss was overwhelming. Of the roughly 270 men who departed with Magellan, merely 18 would complete the circumnavigation, returning to Spain 3 years afterward on the one remaining ship, the Victoria. Magellan himself wasn't among them. He was killed in the Philippines. However, the disease he had transported across the Pacific had killed considerably more of his men than any enemy weapon. It had become evident that the single greatest killer at sea wasn't storms, not shipwreck, not piracy, and not warfare. It was a mundane, creeping sickness that originated from the food barrels. Over the following 3 centuries, the age of sail, it is calculated that this affliction killed more than 2 million sailors. It was a tax paid in human lives for every voyage of trade, exploration, and conquest. It determined the routes ships could take, the duration of time they could remain at sea, and the probability of a crew returning home. An admiral planning a naval campaign had to factor in that he might lose half his fighting force to sickness before a single cannon was discharged. The disease had conquered the seas, holding the ambitions of nations hostage to its invisible, inexorable power. And what was it like for the men on those ships to experience this sea plague take hold? It didn't strike like a fever, sudden and hot. It was a gradual, quiet unraveling of the self, a methodical deconstruction of the body that started so subtly it could be mistaken for simple exhaustion. At first, it was just a profound weariness, a deep lethargy that settled into the bones. A sailor, a man whose life was defined by hard physical labor, would find himself struggling to climb the rigging. His muscles would ache with a dull, persistent pain, as if from a strain that never healed. He would feel a longing for sleep that no amount of rest could satisfy. This exhaustion was more than physical. It was an exhaustion of the spirit, a heavy melancholy that colored the endless blue of the ocean with a tint of grey despair. This was the first whisper of the disease, the quiet announcement that the body's essential reserves were depleted. Then the more overt signs would begin to appear written on the skin. Small dark red or purple spots no bigger than a pinprick would blossom across the man's legs and arms. These were petechiae, tiny hemorrhages where the smallest blood vessels, the capillaries, had become fragile and were beginning to break down. The body was losing its ability to contain itself. Soon, larger bruises would appear, dark and ugly stains on the skin, often around the joints. A slight bump against a cannon or a wooden crate would result in a massive, disproportionate bruise that wouldn't fade for weeks. The skin itself seemed to lose its resilience, becoming dry, rough, and scaly. The sailor's body was becoming a brittle, fragile thing, ill-suited to the harsh environment of the ship. The most infamous and terrifying symptoms, however, manifested in the mouth. It began with the gums. They would become tender and then begin to swell, the tissue turning a livid purple red, shiny and bloated. The flesh would feel soft and spongy to the touch and would bleed spontaneously or with the slightest pressure from a piece of hardtack. As the disease progressed, this swelling became grotesque. The gums would grow over the teeth, burying them in a mass of putrid tissue. The breath of the afflicted man would become overpoweringly foul, a stench of rot and decay that would fill the cramped, airless confines of the lower deck. This was the smell of this illness, the signature scent of the long voyage. The teeth, their foundations eaten away by the diseased gums, would begin to loosen in their sockets. A man might feel them shift and click as he spoke. Eventually, they would simply fall out clean and intact into his hand or his meager bowl of gruel. To be a sailor in the age of sail was, for many to be toothless by the age of 30. But perhaps the most bizarre and psychologically disturbing symptom was the resurrection of old wounds. The very process of healing, it turned out, was not a permanent act. The body required a constant supply of this unknown nutrient to maintain its repairs. Without it, the body forgot how to be whole. A scar from a sword cut received in a tavern brawl years before, long since healed into a pale, thin line, would begin to ache. It would turn a dark, bruised colour, then soften and swell. Finally, the scar tissue would dissolve and the wound would split open once more, raw and bleeding as if the injury had just occurred. A broken leg that had mended 20 years prior would spontaneously refracture, the bones simply giving way as the man walked across the deck. It was a terrifying spectacle, a form of biological haunting. It suggested that the body was not a stable, solid entity, but a fragile temporary construction constantly on the verge of falling back into its constituent parts. A man was literally coming undone, his personal history of injury replaying itself on his flesh. As the body disintegrated, the mind often followed. The initial lethargy deepened into a profound and immobilizing depression. Men would lie in their hammocks, staring blankly at the deck beams above, too weak and too hopeless to move. They were perfectly lucid, fully aware of their own slow-motion decay. They watched their friends sicken and die, knowing that the same fate was unspooling within their own bodies. There was no enemy to fight, no storm to brave, nothing to be done but wait. Their limbs would swell with fluid, their joints seizing up with excruciating pain. In the final stages, they might suffer from sudden massive hemorrhaging, bleeding from the nose, the stomach, or into the brain itself, leading to a mercifully quick death. Others would simply waste away their muscles, atrophying till their heart itself, a muscle, grew too weak to beat. The sailor didn't just die of this disease. He was dismantled by it piece by piece while the ship sailed on under a beautiful, indifferent sky. It was a living death, a slow surrender of the body's integrity, played out over months in the middle of the empty, endless sea. In the quiet, creaking world of the wooden ship, where every sound was familiar, the groan of timbers, the snap of canvas, the eternal sigh of the sea, there was an enemy that made no sound at all. It didn't announce itself with the crash of a cannon or the splintering of a mast. It simply arrived, a foul passenger that boarded with every crew, and its presence was felt long before it was understood. Before science could give it a name and a cause, this affliction was a ghost, a curse, and its true nature was shrouded in a thick, rolling fog of human misunderstanding. For generations, the greatest minds of the sea and the shore squinted into this fog and saw not a simple deficiency, but a host of phantoms of their own making. The most pervasive of these phantoms was the ancient fear of bad air, miasma. The very word hangs in the air, heavy and damp like the smell of the bilge. On a long voyage, the air below decks became a living thing, a thick, palpable soup of odour. It was the scent of unwashed bodies crammed into hammocks, the stale breath of 100 sleeping men, the rot of forgotten food, the inescapable dampness that seeped into the very wood of the ship, and of course, the rank sulphurous perfume of the bilge water sloshing in the vessel's depths. To the sailors and their officers, it seemed perfectly logical that sickness could be born from such an atmosphere. Disease, they believed, was a poison carried on the wind, a punishment for breathing the wrong air. And so they fought this invisible enemy with remedies that were as theatrical as they were useless. They would burn tar, its acrid smoke intended to purify the stale air. They would swish vinegar across the decks, its sharp scent, a hopeful antiseptic. Most dramatically, they would set off small explosions of gunpowder between decks, a practice known as firing the guns. The sharp crack and plume of sulphurous smoke meant to blast the miasma into oblivion. The men would cough and choke, their eyes watering, and the officers would nod, satisfied that the air had been cleansed. But the disease remained, indifferent to the smoke and noise. It cared nothing for the quality of the air. It was waiting in their food. If the air wasn't to blame, then perhaps the fault lay with the men themselves. In the rigidly hierarchical world of the Royal Navy or the Spanish Armada, it was often simplest to blame the lowest rung on the ladder. Laziness, it was said, was the true cause, a moral failing, a rot of the spirit that manifested as a rot of the flesh. Senior officers and admiralty officials, comfortable in their well-appointed cabins or their London offices, would write with great authority on the indolence of the common sailor. They saw the first symptoms, the lethargy, the deep soul-crushing fatigue, not as a medical condition but as a lack of discipline. The sailor who could no longer haul a rope with vigor, who struggled to climb the rigging, was not sick. He was shirking. His weakness was a choice. This created a terrible circular logic. The disease made a man too weak to work, and his inability to work was then cited as the cause of his illness. The cure, therefore, was not medicine but discipline. More work, more flogging. The cat o' nine tails was prescribed to invigorate the blood of a man whose blood was in fact failing him on a chemical level. It was an astonishingly cruel theory, but a convenient one. It absolved the leadership of any responsibility for the men's diet or living conditions. The problem wasn't the salt pork and hardtack. It was the flawed character of the men being fed. Then there was the sea itself. For centuries, sailors had a deeply ambivalent relationship with the ocean. It was their livelihood, their home, their highway to riches. But it was also a vast alien and hostile environment. It seemed plausible that this environment could be poisoning them. The theory of saltwater poisoning took hold. Men were surrounded by water they could not drink, a constant taunting reminder of their thirst. The food they ate was brutally preserved in salt. Salt beef, salt pork, salted fish. Perhaps, the thinking went, this constant exposure to salt, both inside and out, was corrupting their bodies from within. Their blood was becoming too saline, too thick. This led to a desperate obsession with fresh water. Ships' captains would go to extraordinary lengths to refill their casks at any available island or coastline, and inventors dedicated themselves to creating machines that could distill fresh water from the sea. These contraptions of copper pipes and furnaces were complex, expensive, and often woefully inefficient, but they were seen as a potential silver bullet. If saltwater was the poison, then pure freshwater must be the antidote. The men would be given their carefully rationed fresh water, and they would still sicken, still die, while the true cure lay waiting, unheeded, in the wild plants growing on the very shores where they so desperately sought that water. Perhaps the most bizarre and damaging of these theories was the confusion of this disease with venereal disease. It's a difficult connection for the modern mind to make, but in the 18th century, it made a grim kind of sense. Syphilis, the great pox, was rampant, and its latest stage symptoms can be horrific. Advanced stages of this nutritional disease were equally grotesque. A victim's gums would swell and blacken, turning into a spongy, bleeding mass that entombed the teeth. Their skin would erupt in dark, ugly sores and strange bruise-like patterns. Old wounds, even scars from childhood, could suddenly break open and begin to fester as if the injury were fresh. The joints would swell. The bones would ache with a deep, relentless pain. To a physician of the era observing a sailor wasting away with these symptoms, it was not an unreasonable leap to diagnose him with a particularly aggressive form of syphilis. The sailor, after all, was a figure stereotyped for his debauchery in foreign ports. It fit the narrative. This misdiagnosis was a catastrophe. Instead of receiving care, the suffering sailor was treated as a moral pariah. The prescribed cure for syphilis at the time was mercury, a violent poison. Men already weakened to the point of collapse by a nutritional deficiency were now subjected to treatments that caused them to salivate uncontrollably, their teeth to loosen and fall out, confusingly similar to the symptoms of the disease itself, and their bodies to be racked with tremors and agony. They were being poisoned as a cure for a disease they did not have, all while the real affliction continued its silent, methodical destruction. This fog of misinformation was more than just academic error. It had a body count in the hundreds of thousands. It sent men to their deaths, convinced their illness was caused by bad air, a weak will, or a moral failing, never knowing that the cure was as simple as humble as a piece of fruit. Yet, even in the deepest fog, a light can sometimes shine through, if only for a moment. Long before the scientists and the naval surgeons began to count their dead, there were accidental discoveries, fleeting moments of hope where the cure for this affliction was found, used, and then tragically forgotten. These were not moments of scientific rigor, but of desperate improvisation, of listening to unfamiliar wisdom, of pure dumb luck. And they dot the history of the age of sail like tiny, isolated islands, of salvation in a vast ocean of suffering. One of the most remarkable of these forgotten cures took place in the brutal Canadian winter of 1535. The French explorer Jacques Cartier had sailed his 3 small ships up the St. Lawrence River, establishing a camp near the Iroquoian village of Stadacona, the site of modern-day Quebec City. He and his men intended to winter there, confident in their European resilience. They were unprepared for the reality. The river froze solid, trapping their ships in a vise of ice several feet thick. The snow piled up in monstrous drifts, confined to their ships, living on their dwindling, monotonous rations of salted meat and biscuits. The Frenchmen began to fall ill. It started slowly, as it always does, a feeling of weariness, aches in the legs. Then the horrifying transformation. Their gums swelled and rotted, their teeth fell out, their limbs became bloated and discoloured. By February of 1536, nearly all of Cartier's 110 men were desperately sick, and 25 had already died. Cartier, a man of faith, ordered religious processions and prayed for a miracle. The miracle came not from the heavens, but from the people of the land. The Stadaconans, watching the strange visitors suffer from a disease they knew well, took pity on them. Cartier noticed that an Iroquoian man named Domagaya, whom he had known to be sick, was suddenly healthy and active. He questioned him, and Domagaya described a cure. It was a special tea, a decoction made by boiling the leaves and bark of a particular evergreen tree, which he called aneda. The desperate Frenchmen, with nothing left to lose, followed the instructions. They stripped branches from the tree, likely an eastern white cedar or a pine, and boiled them in a large cauldron. The resulting brew was bitter and strange, but they drank it. They even applied the sodden, boiled foliage as a poultice to their swollen limbs. The effect was, in Cartier's own words, miraculous. Within days, the men began to recover. The sores on their skin faded. The swelling in their joints subsided. The putrid flesh of their gums began to heal. The recovery was so swift, so total, that it seemed like magic. They had found the cure. They had been saved by local knowledge, a simple herbal remedy from the people of the First Nations. And here is the tragedy. Cartier meticulously recorded this event in his journal. He described the tree, the method of preparation, and the astonishing results. The information was there in black and white. But when he returned to France, this incredible discovery was lost. It became a curious anecdote in a travelogue, not a medical breakthrough. European physicians steeped in the classical theories of humours and miasmas paid it no mind. It was folk medicine, the superstitious practice of savages. They couldn't even be sure which tree aneda was, and so the knowledge vanished. For the next 200 years, countless thousands of European sailors would die from the very same disease that Jacques Cartier's crew had conquered in a frozen river in Canada. The cure had been found and then carelessly tossed aside, a fleeting glimpse of hope swallowed once more by the fog. This was not the only instance. The pattern repeated itself over and over. In the 1590s, the English Admiral Sir Richard Hawkins, a seasoned mariner, noted in his memoirs that during his voyages, he had learned that sour oranges and lemons were a certain remedy for this infirmity. He saw it with his own eyes. He declared it a certainty, but his observation was buried among countless other details of navigation and naval life. It was one man's opinion, not official policy. It wasn't studied or tested. It was just another piece of sailor's lore. The Dutch, ever the pragmatists of the sea, took a more systematic approach, though, one based on logistics rather than medicine. They established outpost gardens on remote islands like St. Helena in the South Atlantic. It was a strategic decision. Their ships, making the long and punishing journey to the East Indies, could stop there and take on fresh greens and water. It was a refreshment station, and it worked. The crews that stopped at St. Helena had far lower rates of this disease than those who did not. They knew on a practical level that fresh food kept their sailors alive, but they didn't fully grasp the specific mechanism. They didn't isolate the cure down to one specific ingredient. They saw it as a general benefit of freshness, a break from the monotony of the sea diet. If a ship was blown off course and missed the island, its crew would sicken and die just like any other. The hope was tied to a single point on a map, not to a universal principle that could be carried aboard the ship itself. These accidental cures and fleeting hopes were like messages in a bottle, tossed into the sea of history. Most never reached the shore. A few washed up were briefly examined and then discarded. The knowledge was fragmented, anecdotal, and always at odds with the powerful entrenched medical theories of the day. To the establishment, it seemed too simple, too mundane. A disease of such profound and terrifying power surely couldn't be vanquished by something as common as a lemon or the leaf of a tree. The answer had to be more complex, more academic, and so the ships continued to sail and the men continued to die, waiting for a hero. Not a hero of the sword, but a hero of the scientific method. A man who would not just stumble upon the cure, but who would prove it beyond all doubt in the most unlikely of laboratories, the floating wooden world of a British man of war. The turning point, the moment the fog of misinformation finally began to lift, did not occur in a grand university or a royal physician's chamber. It happened in the cramped, damp, rolling confines of a British warship on patrol in the English Channel. The year was 1747, and the ship was HMS Salisbury, a 50-gun fourth-rate vessel of the line. Aboard this ship was a quiet, observant, and deeply compassionate Scotsman named James Lind. He was the ship's surgeon, a man who had seen firsthand the slow, undignified horror of this affliction. He had watched countless young, strong sailors waste away into hollow-eyed spectres, their bodies disintegrating while their minds remained sharp. He had tried all the established remedies, the vinegar, the potions, the purges, and had seen them all fail. But Lind was different from his contemporaries. He was not just a practitioner, he was a scholar. He had read the old accounts, including the tales of Cartier's miracle and the observations of Hawkins. He was aware of the dozens of conflicting theories, and he was struck by the lack of any real evidence to support any of them. He decided that speculation was not enough. The time had come for an experiment. The conditions were grimly perfect. In May of 1747, after 10 weeks at sea, the familiar signs of the disease began to appear among the crew of the Salisbury. Men grew tired. The gums began to swell. Lind knew the disease would only get worse. He saw his chance not just to treat, but to learn. He conceived of an experiment so simple, so elegant, and so revolutionary in its design that it is now regarded as one of the first controlled clinical trials in the history of medicine. He began by selecting 12 sailors, all suffering from the condition to a similar degree. He described them in his notes with clinical precision. Their gums were rotten, their legs were full of blotches and tumours. To ensure a fair comparison, he had them all housed in the same area of the ship, the forecastle, and kept them on the same basic diet. A miserable affair of water, gruel, sugar and mutton broth. With his baseline established, he divided the 12 men into 6 pairs. Each pair would continue with the standard diet, but would receive a different additional supplement, one of the many proposed cures for the disease. It was a methodical comparative test designed to isolate the single variable that might make a difference. The first group of 2 men was given a quart of cider every day. Cider had long been a popular sailor's drink, and some believed its fermented apple base held curative properties. The second group received 25 drops of elixir of vitriol, what we would now call sulfuric acid, 3 times a day. This was a popular remedy among physicians who believed its astringent properties would tone the body's tissues. The third pair was dosed with 2 spoonfuls of vinegar 3 times a day, another common acidic treatment believed to counteract the supposed putrefaction of the body caused by the disease. A fourth group was made to drink half a pint of seawater each day, a treatment based on the theory that the body needed to be purged of its internal poisons. The fifth group was given a medicinal paste made of garlic, mustard seed, myrrh, and other herbs, a complex concoction drawn from the traditional pharmacopoeia. And finally, the sixth pair, the last 2 men, were given a simple prescription, 2 oranges and 1 lemon each day. The experiment began on the 20th of May. For the first few days, Lind watched his patients carefully, making meticulous notes. There was little change. The men on the seawater continued to decline. The men on the vitriol and vinegar complained of the foul taste, but showed no improvement. The men drinking the cider reported feeling slightly better, a little more energetic, but their physical symptoms remained. The sailors eating the herbal paste were miserable. But then something remarkable began to happen in the 6th group. The 2 men eating the oranges and the lemon began to recover, and their recovery was not gradual. It was astonishingly swift. After just 6 days of the citrus treatment, one of the men was so fully recovered that he was deemed fit for duty and returned to his post. The other was so much improved that he was able to act as a nurse for the other 10 sick men in the experiment. The effect was undeniable, immediate and profound. Lind had his answer clear as a summer sky. The experiment came to an abrupt end simply because the ship's supply of fresh fruit ran out. Lind had proven his case, but he could no longer continue the winning treatment. It was a stark reminder of the logistical challenges that lay ahead, but the evidence was incontrovertible. While the other 10 men languished, their conditions either static or worsening. The 2 who had eaten citrus fruits were for all intents and purposes cured. Lind had done more than just heal 2 sailors. He had conducted a fair test. By comparing multiple treatments simultaneously under the same conditions, he had systematically eliminated the ineffective remedies and isolated the one that worked. It was the scientific method applied with brilliant simplicity in the most challenging of environments. Now comes the great soul-crushing irony of the story of James Lind. He had the cure. He had the proof. In 1753, 6 years after his experiment, he published his findings in a lengthy and detailed book, a treatise of the scurvy. And then, for nearly half a century, nothing happened. The Royal Navy, the largest and most powerful organization on the planet, did not immediately adopt his recommendations. The ships kept sailing with their cargoes of vinegar and elixir of vitriol, and the sailors kept dying by the thousands. The reasons for this delay are a perfect storm of human fallibility and institutional inertia. The Admiralty was a vast conservative bureaucracy, resistant to change and skeptical of new ideas from a lowly ship surgeon. Oranges and lemons were expensive, especially compared to cheap mass-produced cider or vinegar. Worse, they were perishable. How could you possibly stock a ship with enough fresh fruit for a 3-year voyage? Lind himself, in a strange twist, unintentionally undermined his own brilliant discovery. In his treatise, he didn't lead with his experiment. He buried it deep within 400 pages of dense academic prose, where he gave equal time and consideration to all the other incorrect theories of the disease. He was being a thorough scholar, but he clouded his own central message. He also, with the best of intentions, made a fatal recommendation to solve the problem of preserving the fruit. He suggested boiling the citrus juice down into a concentrated syrup. A rob. It seemed a sensible idea for long-term storage. But he couldn't have known that the heat would destroy the very thing that made the juice work, the fragile, then unknown molecule we now call vitamin C. For decades, the Navy would experiment with this boiled, useless syrup and, seeing no results, would conclude that Lind's citrus cure was ineffective. The truth, so clearly demonstrated on the decks of HMS Salisbury, was found, published, and then promptly lost again in a haze of poor communication, bureaucratic inertia, and bad chemistry. The age of scientific proof had dawned, but the age of institutional implementation was still a long way over the horizon. One might imagine James Lind's A Treatise of the Scurvy, published in 1753, landing like a bombshell in the wood-panelled offices of the British Admiralty. One might picture bewigged commissioners, their faces illuminated by the grey London light filtering through tall windows, poring over its pages and immediately issuing orders for a fleet-wide supply of lemons. One would, of course, be imagining a world that runs on logic and efficiency. The real world, particularly the world of 18th century bureaucracy, runs on precedent, on thrift, and on the comfortable inertia of established thought. And so Lind's elegant proof, his meticulously documented experiment aboard HMS Salisbury, did not land like a bombshell. It landed with the soft, unalarming thud of a single book being placed on a very, very crowded shelf in a very, very large library of competing ideas. There it would gather dust for nearly half a century. A silence of 42 years to be precise. A silence measured not in time, but in the slow, agonizing deaths of tens of thousands of sailors. The reasons for this lethal pause are not simple. They're a complex tapestry, woven from institutional stubbornness, economic reality, and the very nature of scientific progress itself. To understand the Admiralty's indifference, you must first understand the Admiralty itself. It was not a single entity, but a sprawling, compartmentalized organism. The Lords of the Admiralty set naval strategy. The Navy Board built the ships. The Victualling Board, based at its own grand headquarters at Somerset House, was responsible for provisioning those ships, and the Sick and Hurt Board, a body of physicians, was tasked with the health of the sailors. For Lind's discovery to be implemented, all these gears of the great naval machine had to turn in unison. An order for citrus would have to be approved by the physicians, deemed affordable by the Victualling Board, and finally mandated by the Lords Commissioners. Any friction in any one of those gears could and did grind the entire process to a halt. The physicians of the sick and hurt were learned men, products of Edinburgh and London universities. They were steeped in the classical theories of medicine, of humours and miasmas. Lind's proposal that a common fruit could cure a terrifying systemic disease struck many of them as simplistic. A piece of folk wisdom unworthy of serious consideration, it smacked of alchemy, not anatomy. Science in their age was becoming wonderfully complex. There were new theories about chemistry, about gases and acids and the very fabric of life. This disease, they felt, must have an equally complex cause and an equally sophisticated cure. It seemed far more intellectually satisfying to attribute the disease to a grand process, a kind of internal decay. The theory of putrefaction was especially popular. The thinking went that the combination of foul air in the ship's hold, the constant damp, and a diet of hard, indigestible salt beef caused a man's very tissues to begin to spoil from within. The cure, therefore, must be an antiseptic, something that arrested this decay. And so the Sick and Hurt Board championed remedies that sounded far more scientific than a simple orange. They recommended elixir of vitriol, sulfuric acid diluted in alcohol and water. It was sharp, it was powerful, and it was undeniably chemical. It also did absolutely nothing for the disease, but it had the ring of authority. Then there was the very compelling work of Dr. David McBride, an Irish physician who proposed a cure that was not only plausible, but wonderfully convenient. McBride theorized that the affliction was caused by a loss of fixed air, what we would now call carbon dioxide from the body's tissues. The way to restore this vital gas, he argued, was through fermentation. His cure was wort of malt. This was essentially a sweet, unfermented beer made by soaking malted barley in hot water. It was easy to make on board. It used ingredients the victualling board already stocked in vast quantities, and it was British to its core. Wort was cheap, it was familiar, and it fit perfectly into the existing naval supply chain. It seemed to offer a path of least resistance. McBride's book was a success, and the Admiralty, ever eager for a cost-effective solution, ordered large-scale trials of his wort. The results were, as is so often the case with placebos and half-measures, ambiguous. Some captains reported it seemed to help a little, others saw no effect, but the ambiguity was enough. It created noise, confusion. It allowed the simple, clear signal from Lynn's experiment to be lost in a sea of conflicting data and more palatable theories. And then there was the brutal, unassailable logic of cost. Oranges and lemons were in the 18th century luxury goods. They grew in Spain and Italy, countries with which Britain was frequently at war. Sourcing them required a complex international supply chain. They were perishable. To supply the entire Royal Navy with a regular ration of citrus juice would have been astronomically expensive. The Victualling Board, tasked with feeding hundreds of thousands of men on a tightly controlled budget, balked at the expense. They could provide a gallon of beer for a few pennies. They could provide salt beef and hardtack by the literal ton for a fixed, predictable price. But a crate of lemons, the cost was volatile, the supply uncertain. A naval accountant sitting in his London office could perform a cold, grim calculation. He could weigh the cost of 1,000 lemons against the cost of replacing the 10 or 20 men who might die on a particular voyage. And in an age of press gangs and high unemployment, a sailor was tragically a replaceable part. The citrus was not, so they stuck with what they knew: beer, biscuit, and the occasional futile dose of sulfuric acid. Lind himself, a modest and unassuming man, was not a skilled political operator. He did not lobby the Admiralty relentlessly. In later editions of his own treatise, perhaps seeking to appear more comprehensive and less dogmatic, he even discussed other potential remedies, including wort of malt, thereby diluting the singular power of his own discovery. The cure was there, printed in black and white, but the system was not ready to receive it. The men in charge were not villains. They were simply men of their time trapped in a web of fiscal conservatism, flawed science, and a bureaucracy designed to resist rather than embrace radical change. The price for this resistance was paid in blood and bile in the quiet, desperate misery of countless sailors whose gums rotted and whose limbs failed, all for the want of a simple, sour fruit. While the medical establishment of London and the administrators of the Royal Navy were mired in theory and tradition, a man of intensely practical genius was about to rewrite the rules of long-distance voyaging. This man was not a physician, but a navigator, a farmer's son from Yorkshire, whose obsessive attention to detail would change the map of the world. His name was Captain James Cook. When Cook was given command of HMS Endeavour in 1768 with secret orders to sail to the South Pacific, observe the transit of Venus, and then search for the great undiscovered southern continent, he was handed what was widely considered a death sentence for a significant portion of his crew. A voyage of that length, 2 or even 3 years out of sight of friendly ports, meant that this disease was not a risk. It was a certainty. But Cook was a different kind of commander. He viewed the health of his crew not as a matter of fate, but as a logistical problem to be solved with the same methodical rigor he applied to charting an unknown coastline. He would not conquer the affliction with a single magic bullet, for he did not believe in one. He would conquer it through a relentless, systematic assault on every front. He would conquer it with discipline. Cook's strategy was holistic. It began not with medicine, but with hygiene. 18th century warships were squalid, crowded and damp, perfect incubators for disease. Cook waged a war on filth. He mandated a level of cleanliness that was unheard of in the Navy. The decks below, where the men slept in their hammocks, were to be constantly scraped and dried. Braziers of coal were carried through the ship to dry the damp air. Whenever the weather allowed, the men's bedding and clothes were brought up on the deck to be aired out in the sun. The entire ship was regularly fumigated by burning gunpowder and washing the timbers with vinegar. This obsessive cleanliness had a profound effect. It dramatically reduced the incidence of other diseases like typhus and dysentery, which often weakened sailors and made them more susceptible to the main affliction, or simply killed them before the great malady had a chance to take hold. A healthier crew, Cook reasoned, was a more resilient crew. His second front was diet. Cook was a relentless experimenter, willing to try anything and everything that might keep the disease at bay. The Admiralty, enamored with Dr. McBride's theory, had loaded his ship with 75 bushels of malt to make the wort. Cook dutifully brewed it and made his men drink it, noting in his journal that he found it of great service, though he did not consider it a definitive cure. They also supplied him with a syrup, a rob of oranges and lemons. This was a thick boiled-down concentrate, which we now know was utterly useless. The process of boiling for hours to reduce the juice into a transportable syrup destroyed virtually all the vitamin C. Cook's mixed results with this substance would ironically later be used as evidence against the efficacy of citrus, further confusing the issue. But the most famous of Cook's provisions was sauerkraut. He had taken on nearly 8,000 pounds of it on the advice of German physicians, who noted that Dutch sailors who ate it regularly seemed to suffer less from the disease. Getting his tough, skeptical British sailors to eat what they considered to be foul-smelling, slimy, pickled German cabbage was a challenge in command. Cook did not simply order them to eat it. That would have invited mutiny. Instead, he employed a masterstroke of psychology. He had the sauerkraut prepared and served every day, but only at his own table to the officers in the great cabin. He made no comment, issued no orders. He simply let the crew watch as the captain and his gentlemen ate it with apparent enjoyment. As he predicted, human nature did the rest. The men, assuming that anything reserved for the officers must be a delicacy, soon began to demand their own share. Within a week, the sauerkraut was so popular he had to ration it. Sauerkraut, through its fermentation process, does retain a modest amount of vitamin C. It was not a cure, but as a preventative consumed over many months, it was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It kept the baseline of health just that little bit higher. But the true genius of Cook's method, the real reason he lost so few men to the disease across 3 epic voyages, was his relentless and uncompromising pursuit of fresh food at every opportunity. For Cook, a coastline was not just a line on a map, it was a potential larder. At every landfall, no matter how remote or brief the stay, the first priority was to send foraging parties ashore. In Tierra del Fuego, at the frozen tip of South America, his men, under the guidance of the expedition's naturalist Joseph Banks, gathered vast quantities of wild celery and a local plant they called scurvy grass. In the tropical paradise of Tahiti, they bartered for breadfruit, bananas and coconuts. In New Zealand, they learned from the Maori to harvest a kind of wild spinach. He compelled his men to eat these greens, boiling them into their soup and portable broth. He was merciless in this. When 2 of his sailors refused to eat the fresh provisions, he had them flogged. "No one will ever be able to say," he wrote, "that I have not taken every precaution in my power to preserve the crew in health." This constant, systematic replenishment of vitamin C from natural sources was what kept the disease from ever taking a fatal hold on his ships. When Cook returned to England in 1771 after his first circumnavigation, having been at sea for nearly 3 years, he had not lost a single man to the disease. It was an achievement so staggering that it was met with disbelief. On his second voyage, an even more ambitious journey into the Antarctic Circle, he lost only 1 man to the disease out of a crew of over 100. The results were undeniable. Cook had proven that this affliction was not an inevitable consequence of long sea voyages. It was a conquerable foe. He was celebrated as a hero, awarded the Copley Medal by the prestigious Royal Society, not for his cartography, but for his paper on preserving the health of seamen. Yet, in a final tragic irony, Cook's very success helped to delay the final solution, because his entire system had worked: the hygiene, the sauerkraut, the malt, the foraging. He could not and did not isolate the single critical factor. In his celebrated paper, he gave credit to all his methods, but he particularly praised the wort of malt, the Admiralty's preferred cure. He concluded that the rob of citrus was of little use. He had performed a miracle of practical health management, but because he didn't understand the precise science, his conclusions pointed the medical establishment in all the wrong directions at once. He had shown them the promised land, but had handed them a faulty map to get there. The final piece of the puzzle would not be put in place by a navigator on the high seas, but by a physician who understood the corridors of power, as well as he understood the wards of a naval hospital. The catalyst for change would not be a voyage of discovery, but a war for national survival. As the 18th century drew to its bloody close, Britain found itself locked in a titanic struggle against revolutionary and then Napoleonic France. This was a new kind of war, a total war, and its decisive battlefield was the ocean. The Royal Navy's grand strategy depended on its ability to maintain a constant, unblinking watch over French ports, a strategy known as the close blockade. Fleets under commanders like Cornwallis and Nelson had to remain on station off Brest, off Toulon for months, sometimes years, through brutal winter gales and stifling summer heat. This was the challenge of logistics and human endurance on an unprecedented scale. And the single greatest threat to this strategy was not a French cannonball, but the insidious internal rot of this affliction. A blockading squadron could be rendered impotent in a matter of months as its crew sickened and died, forcing the ships back to port and leaving the enemy free to sail. The disease had ceased to be a mere medical problem. It had become a critical strategic vulnerability. It was in this crucible of existential threat that Gilbert Blaine rose to prominence. Blaine was everything James Lind was not. He was ambitious, politically astute, and well-connected. As a physician to the fleet under Admiral Sir George Rodney in the West Indies during the American War of Independence, he had witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of the affliction on naval operations. He saw entire squadrons crippled, saw ships with more than half their crews unable to work the sails. He kept meticulous records, compiling a mountain of statistical evidence. Blaine was a man of the Enlightenment, a believer in data. He read Lind's treatise and saw the truth in its simple, elegant experiment. He studied Cook's voyages, but unlike Cook himself, he filtered out the noise. He saw that while the sauerkraut and the wort of malt might have helped, the one constant factor in Cook's success was the relentless acquisition of fresh vegetable matter. He concluded that Lind had been right all along. The cure was citrus. Armed with his data and his conviction, Blaine began a relentless campaign. He used his society connections to gain the ear of influential admirals and politicians. He was appointed to the Sick and Hurt Board, the very body that had ignored Lind for decades, and began to reform it from within. He wrote papers. He presented evidence. He framed the argument not in medical terms, but in the language of military logistics and national security. He argued that the cost of lemons was trivial compared to the cost of a crippled fleet, a lost battle, or a successful French invasion. He pointed out the immense expense of manning naval hospitals in Portsmouth and Plymouth, which in some years were filled with over 10,000 scorbutic patients, men who could have been serving at sea. Providing lemon juice, he argued, was not an expense. It was an investment in naval efficiency, a weapon of war as potent as a new 100-gun ship of the line. The tipping point came in 1794. The Admiralty, finally swayed by Blaine's relentless logic, authorized a decisive trial. HMS Suffolk, bound for India, was to be a floating laboratory. Along with its standard provisions, the ship was supplied with a large quantity of lemon juice preserved with a small amount of spirits. Every man on board was given a daily ration. The voyage was long and arduous, lasting 23 weeks and one day without once touching land. In previous years, such a journey would have been a catastrophe. The Suffolk arrived in Madras with its crew in a state of health that was, by the standards of the day, miraculous. There had been a few mild cases of the disease at the beginning of the voyage, but the lemon juice had quickly resolved them. There were no deaths. The experiment was an undeniable, resounding success. The evidence was now too overwhelming to ignore. In 1795, the Lords of the Admiralty, with Gilbert Blaine's memorandum on their desk, finally issued the historic order. The Royal Navy was to provide a daily issue of 3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice to all seamen to be mixed with their daily ration of grog, the mixture of rum and water that was a staple of naval life. The effect was immediate and profound. It was as if a switch had been thrown. The disease, the ancient scourge of the sea, the terror of every deep-water sailor vanished from the ships of the Royal Navy almost overnight. Naval hospitals emptied. Press gangs became less essential as experienced sailors could now serve for longer, their health and lives preserved. The operational capacity of the fleet was transformed. Ships could now keep the sea for indefinite periods. Nelson's fleet, which held its station off Toulon for nearly 2 years before chasing the French to the West Indies and back, culminating in the decisive victory at Trafalgar in 1805, could not have done so without the lemon juice. The defeat of Napoleon owed as much to Gilbert Blane and the humble lemon as it did to the Duke of Wellington. Britain's sailors, now the healthiest in the world, gained a decisive edge over their French and Spanish rivals, who continued to suffer from the old malady. This newfound maritime health gave them a swagger, a reputation for hardiness that was both earned and envied, and it earned them a nickname. In later years, in a move driven by colonial economics, the Admiralty began to substitute cheaper West Indian-grown limes for the more expensive Mediterranean lemons. It was a fateful decision. Limes, particularly the variety grown in the West Indies, contained significantly less vitamin C than lemons. Furthermore, the juice was often processed and stored in ways that degraded what little vitamin content it had. This switch would decades later lead to a disastrous resurgence of the disease on British Arctic expeditions, plunging the medical world into a new round of confusion and debate. But in the great age of sail, the practice stuck. Other navies, watching the robust health of the British tars, began to refer to them, sometimes with a sneer, as lime juices, or more simply, limeys. The name, born of an administrative shortcut and a botanical error, would endure long after the great wooden warships had vanished, a final ironic echo of the long and bitter war against a disease that was at last conquered by the sea. The great puzzle of this affliction, it seemed, had been solved. James Lind had shown the way. Gilbert Blane and the Royal Navy had institutionalized the cure, making the British sailor the healthiest man afloat, the terror of the seas. But knowledge, you see, is a fragile thing. It is not a monolith carved in stone. It is more like a memory susceptible to fading, to reinterpretation, to the quiet corruptions of economy and convenience. And as the 19th century dawned, bringing with it an intoxicating new faith in industrial progress, the old lessons began to fray at the edges. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The disease was simply waiting, biding its time in the coldest, most unforgiving corners of the world, ready to re-emerge on the frozen frontier. The Arctic, a place of profound silence and blinding whiteness, where the sea becomes a solid, fractured continent, and the sun is a fleeting memory for half the year. It was the last great blank space on the map, and for the British Admiralty, brimming with post-Napoleonic confidence in ships to spare, it was an irresistible challenge. The quest for the Northwest Passage became a national obsession, and so they sent their finest ships and their bravest men into the ice, equipped with the very best that technology could offer. This included a marvelous new invention: tinned food, airtight canisters of preserved beef, mutton, and vegetable soup, promising a varied and wholesome diet that would last for years. It was the logical next step, a modern industrial improvement upon the old diet of salt beef and hardtack. And of course, they packed the requisite antiscorbutics, the lemon juice. But here, in the quiet details of logistics, the tragedy was being written. The Admiralty, in a move of pennywise bureaucracy, had long since switched its supply from the expensive Mediterranean, lemons rich in the vital agent, to the more readily available and cheaper West Indian limes from its own colonies. Limes, we now know, contain less than half the protective power of lemons, a significant downgrade, but worse was the processing. To preserve the juice for the long voyage, it was often boiled down into a thick, dark concentrate, a process that used copper vats and heat, two things that are exceptionally effective at destroying the delicate, unseen molecule they were trying to preserve. The men of these polar expeditions were being supplied with a remedy that had been systematically stripped of its potency. They were carrying a ghost, a memory of a cure, and so we come to the expedition that would become a legend. Victorian ghost story whispered in fireside tales and parliamentary inquiries for decades to come. The Franklin Expedition. In May of 1845, Sir John Franklin, a veteran of the ice, sailed from England with two magnificent ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They were reinforced for the crushing pressures of the pack ice, fitted with steam engines and propellers, and stocked with provisions for 3 years. On board were 129 officers and men, the cream of the Royal Navy. They carried over 8,000 tins of preserved meats and soups, supplied by a contractor named Stephen Goldner, whose canning process would later be found to be rushed and catastrophically flawed. And they carried casks of the official boiled and largely useless lime juice concentrate. They were sighted one last time by a whaler in Baffin Bay in late July, waiting for the ice to clear. Then they sailed west into the labyrinth of islands and vanished from the world. For years, silence. The ships became trapped in the ice near King William Island, just as so many had before. But this time, there would be no escape. We can only imagine the slow, creeping dread. The first winter passes, then a second. The sun vanishes for months on end. The world is reduced to the groan of shifting ice, the howl of the wind, and the cramped lamplight confines of the ships. The tinned food, so full of promise, becomes a source of suspicion. Some of the tins are spoiled. Many were sealed with a thick solder of lead, which leached into the food, slowly poisoning the men, making them weak, confused, and depressed. And then the old enemy, the one they thought they had vanquished, begins to stir. It would have started quietly, a profound lethargy, a bone-deep weariness that the cold and dark could not fully explain, an ache in the joints, then the telltale signs on the gums, the bright, healthy pink turning a bruised, swollen purple, the teeth beginning to loosen in their sockets. Old scars, long-healed wounds from battles fought years ago might begin to ache, their edges softening, threatening to reopen as the body's ability to maintain its own tissues failed. In this frozen, sterile world, the affliction unfolded in its purest, most dreadful form. The men, weakened by lead and the malnutrition, were helpless against it. Their faith was in their advanced technology, their tinned provisions, and their daily dose of official anti-scorbutic, a faith that was entirely misplaced. Franklin himself died in June of 1847. The surviving crews under Captain Crozier finally abandoned the ice-locked ships in the spring of 1848, hoping to trek south to a trading post on the mainland. It was a death march. Skeletons would later be found scattered across the island, some in a desperate line pointing south, others in small groups, one in a makeshift tent. The Inuit who later encountered the wreckage and the dead spoke of men with hard black gums and a strange foul smell. They had seen this before they knew what it was. The search for Franklin became its own epic, spawning dozens of expeditions, and those search parties too battled the disease. But some of them learned a lesson that Franklin's men in their imperial certainty never did. They learned from the Inuit. They learned that the cure for this disease of the barren lands was the land itself, not in its plants which were buried under snow, but in its animals. Eating fresh seal meat, particularly the liver and other organs, which were rich in the very thing they lacked, could hold the disease at bay. It was a return to the most basic empirical wisdom. Eat what the healthy locals eat. It was a lesson some took to heart and others stubbornly rejected. Robert Falcon Scott, on his tragic journey to the South Pole more than half a century later, was still battling the same foe. He dismissed the lime juice theory as outdated and clung to a mistaken belief that the disease was a form of bacterial ptomaine poisoning from tainted meat. His meticulous planning, his scientific rigor, was fatally undermined by this one colossal blind spot. He and his men, having reached the pole, only to find the Norwegian flag of Roald Amundsen already there, perished on the return journey, weakened by starvation, frostbite, and the unmistakable, debilitating signs of the affliction. Amundsen, in contrast, had studied the survival techniques of the Inuit. His men ate fresh seal and even dog meat. They arrived at the pole and returned, all of them in good health. In the crushing, unforgiving calculus of polar exploration, a flawed understanding of this disease was a death sentence. And yet the scourge was never confined to the emptiness of the polar ice or the rolling emptiness of the sea. This affliction is not a disease of place, but of circumstance. It is a malady of isolation, of siege, of any situation where human beings are cut off from the steady supply of fresh living food. It could bloom in the heart of a continent just as readily as in the hold of a ship. And throughout the 19th century, as humanity pushed into new frontiers and convulsed in new conflicts, the disease followed, a silent, persistent shadow. It was a scourge on land. Consider the Great Irish Famine, which began in 1845, the very year Franklin sailed into oblivion. Here was a catastrophe, not of exploration, but of agriculture. An entire nation had become overwhelmingly dependent on a single crop, the potato. The lumper potato was a miracle food capable of producing immense caloric yields from small plots of poor soil. But it was also the primary source of vitamin C for millions of the rural poor. Not because the potato is particularly rich in it, but because it was eaten in such enormous quantities day after day. It provided just enough. Then the blight came. A fungus-like organism Phytophthora infestans swept across the island, turning the potatoes to a black, inedible slime in the ground. Staple food vanished. Starvation followed. And on the heels of starvation came its ghoulish partner, the nutritional disease. The relief efforts organised by the British government in London were tragically inadequate and bound by a rigid ideology of free market economics. They provided cornmeal imported from America Peel's brimstone, the Irish called it, for its yellow colour and tendency to cause digestive distress. It provided calories, but it had none of the antiscorbutic factor. And so an entire population already hollowed out by hunger began to exhibit the classic signs. Their gums swelled and bled, their joints ached, old injuries re-emerged from the deep tissue, children's bones failed to grow properly. It was called blackleg for the terrible bruising and subcutaneous bleeding that marked its advanced stages. The disease was not the primary killer of the famine. That grim distinction belongs to starvation itself, and the typhus and cholera that preyed on weakened bodies crowded into workhouses and soup kitchen queues. But it was this affliction that did much of the weakening. It was the great accomplice, the sapper that undermined the body's defences, making every other affliction more deadly. It was the internal rot that mirrored the rot in the fields. A nationwide nutritional collapse born from a single catastrophic dependency. Half a world away, another kind of madness was unfolding, and the disease was there too. The California gold rush beginning in 1848. Tens of thousands of prospectors, the 49ers, descended on the Sierra Nevada mountains, dreaming of fortunes plucked from the earth. They were mostly young single men, utterly unprepared for the realities of frontier life. They were isolated not by ice or by blight, but by distance and terrain. They lived in rough camps miles from any form of established agriculture. And what did they eat? They ate what was portable and would not spoil. Salt pork, beans, endless amounts of flour, which they baked into hard biscuits or flapjacks. Their diet was a carbon copy of a sailor's on a long voyage. They were adrift on a sea of land, and so miners' version of the disease became rampant in the gold fields. A man could strike it rich, his pockets heavy with gold dust, and still find himself wasting away in his tent, his teeth falling from his head, his legs covered in blotchy bruises, too weak to lift his pickaxe. The letters and diaries of the era are filled with it, men describing a profound sense of melancholy, a physical and spiritual exhaustion that settled over the camps. They blame the bad air, the hard work, the mountain fever. They rarely knew its true name, but some did. And where there is a disease, there is a market for the cure. Enterprising individuals, seeing the desperation, would haul crates of potatoes, onions, or even barrels of pickles into the mountains and sell them for astronomical prices. A single onion could be traded for $1 worth of gold when $1 was a day's wage. Citrus fruits were the ultimate luxury. A lemon, it was said, could be worth its weight in gold dust to a man in the advanced stages of the disease. In the raw, brutal capitalism of the gold rush, the most valuable treasure was not the yellow metal in the ground, but the simple life-giving chemistry locked inside a humble vegetable. Then came the American Civil War, a conflict that marshaled the full industrial might of a nation, and in the process created the perfect conditions for the disease on an industrial scale. Feeding the vast armies of the Union and the Confederacy was a logistical nightmare. The soldiers' diet became a monotonous litany of non-perishables: hardtack, salt, beef, or pork and coffee. While the Union's vast logistical network, the Quartermaster Corps, became increasingly sophisticated, often managing to supply its troops with desiccated vegetables, dried and compressed cakes of mixed greens, and barrels of onions and potatoes. Its reach was not absolute. On long campaigns far from supply depots or during protracted sieges like that of Vicksburg, the affliction would inevitably appear. For the Confederacy, with its agrarian economy, fractured railway system, and the ever-tightening grip of the Union blockade, the problem was exponentially worse. Confederate soldiers were chronically underfed, and what food they did receive was almost entirely devoid of the necessary nutrients. The disease became endemic in many rebel armies, a constant drain on manpower and morale. It haunted the military hospitals and, most infamously, the prisoner of war camps. At Andersonville in Georgia, where tens of thousands of Union prisoners were crowded into a fetid open stockade with minimal shelter and even less food. The affliction raged unchecked. It was part of the constellation of diseases, dysentery, typhoid, hookworm that created an almost unimaginable hell on earth. But it was not just a disease of prisoners. For the common soldier in the field, a key survival skill was foraging. When troops liberated a farmer's vegetable patch or stripped an orchard of its fruit, they weren't just supplementing their meager calories, they were unknowingly medicating themselves. They were fighting the disease with every turnip, every apple, every wild onion they could find. The scorbutic taint, as army surgeons called it, was a recognized military liability, a silent enemy that could cripple a regiment as surely as a volley of rifle fire. The 19th century drew to a close with the disease still a profound mystery. The evidence was overwhelming yet contradictory. Lemons worked, fresh vegetables worked, fresh meat worked, but why? The theories were a tangled mess. Was it an absence of a certain kind of acid? Was it a poison? A ptomaine that developed in poorly preserved food? Was it a bacterial infection? Or was it, as some still argued, a matter of morale and hygiene? The cure was known, but the cause was a black box. To truly conquer the disease, to banish it from the land as well as the sea, science needed a new tool, a new way of thinking. The answer would not be found on the deck of a ship or in a miner's camp, but in the quiet, methodical world of the laboratory. The final piece of the puzzle would fall into place with the dawn of a new century and the birth of a new science, the science of nutrition. The key, as it so often is in science, came from an accident. In 1907, two Norwegian scientists at the University of Christiania, Axel Holst and Theodor Fröhlich, were investigating a different shipboard disease, beriberi, a nerve disorder we now know is caused by a thiamine deficiency. They were trying to induce the disease in laboratory animals to study it. They tried pigeons, which worked. Then, for reasons of their own, they switched to a new test subject, the guinea pig. They fed their guinea pigs a restricted diet of grains and water, expecting them to develop the neurological symptoms of beriberi. But something else happened instead. The animals grew lethargic. Their joints swelled. They began to hemorrhage under their skin. And when Holst and Fröhlich performed autopsies, they found their gums were spongy and bleeding. Their teeth were loose, and their bones were brittle. They were not suffering from beriberi. They were suffering from classic textbook disease. This was a moment of sheer dumb luck and profound scientific insight. Holst and Fröhlich realized what they had stumbled upon. Most animals, it turns out, rats, dogs, pigeons, can synthesize their own ascorbic acid internally. They can't get the disease, but a small handful of species cannot. Among them are certain fruit bats, primates, and guinea pigs. Just like humans, they had lost the ability to make this vital substance and had to get it from their diet. Holst and Fröhlich had by complete accident created the first reliable animal model for the affliction. Now the hunt could begin in earnest. They could test various foodstuffs on their scorbutic guinea pigs and measure the results with scientific precision. They confirmed that fresh cabbage or lemon juice cured the animals while boiled versions did not. The elusive anti-scurvy agent was real, it was measurable, and it was fragile. The intellectual framework was also falling into place. In 1912, the Polish biochemist Casimir Funk, working in London, proposed a revolutionary idea. He had been studying diseases like beriberi and pellagra, and he theorized that they were caused by the lack of trace substances in the diet that were essential for life. He called these substances vitamines, a portmanteau of vital and amine because he mistakenly believed they all belonged to a chemical class called amines. He identified factors for several diseases and proposed that this affliction too was caused by the lack of a specific anti-scorbutic vitamin. The name later shortened to vitamin stuck. The hunt was no longer for a vague principle or an abstract quality of freshness. It was a race to isolate a specific chemical compound, vitamin C. Throughout the 1920s, laboratories around the world chased this chemical ghost. They could concentrate it from lemon juice or cabbage, creating potent extracts that could cure a guinea pig in days. But purifying it, crystallizing it, and determining its chemical structure proved fissually difficult. The substance was unstable, easily destroyed by heat, oxygen, and exposure to metals, and then a brilliant Hungarian biochemist entered the scene. a man who wasn't even looking for vitamin C. His name was Albert Szent-Györgyi. Szent-Györgyi was a restless, charismatic scientist studying the fundamental processes of how cells breathe, cellular respiration. In the late 20s, while working in Cambridge and later in the United States, he isolated a powerful reducing agent, a substance that readily donates electrons from the adrenal glands of cows and also from oranges and cabbage. He found it was a sugar-like acid with 6 carbon atoms, and he named it hexuronic acid. He knew it was biologically important, but he had no idea what its function was. For years, he carried this puzzle with him. In 1930, he returned to his native Hungary to a position at the University of Szeged. Szeged was the world capital of a particular crop, paprika peppers. Szent-Györgyi continued his work on hexuronic acid, but he struggled to get enough of it to analyze. The adrenal glands of local slaughterhouse cows provided only tiny amounts. Then came the moment of serendipity, the kind of story that feels almost too perfect to be true. One evening, his wife served him a fresh paprika for dinner. Szent-Györgyi, not being particularly fond of it, was about to leave it on his plate. But then he looked at the vibrant red pepper. A thought struck him. He had never tested a paprika. He took it to his lab that very night, and he found to his astonishment that it was absolutely packed with hexuronic acid. It was a goldmine. He now had a cheap, plentiful source that yielded the chemical by the kilogram. The final connection was made in 1932. Joseph Scurvy, a young American postdoc who had previously worked in the lab of Charles Glenn King, a leading vitamin C researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, came to work with Szent-Györgyi in Szeged. Scurvy knew the properties of vitamin C intimately from his work with guinea pigs. He and Szent-Györgyi performed the crucial experiment. They took a sample of pure crystalline hexuronic acid from the Szeged paprika, fed it to guinea pigs suffering from the disease, and watched. The animals made a full and rapid recovery. It was undeniable. Hexuronic acid was vitamin C. Almost simultaneously, Charles Glenn King's team in Pittsburgh reached the same conclusion. The ancient enemy finally had a face and a name. Szent-Györgyi, in recognition of its power, renamed his discovery. He called it ascorbic acid from the Latin, a meaning no, and scorbutus, the word for the disease. It was literally the no disease acid. For his work on cellular respiration and this monumental discovery, Albert Szent-Györgyi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1937. The journey was complete. From the ghostly terror in the hold of a ship, to a recognized clinical syndrome, to a problem of naval logistics, to a land-bound plague, and finally to this, a simple, elegant molecule of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, C6H8O6. It could now be understood synthesized in a factory and placed in a pill. The long, slow, stumbling, centuries-long quest to understand the scourge of the seas had ended in the crystalline purity of a chemical formula. The darkness could finally and definitively be banished by the light of science. It would be comforting to think that our story ends there with the vanquishing of a great foe, with the final triumphant discovery of a simple molecule that could hold the entire horrifying edifice of cellular decay at bay. It would be a neat and tidy conclusion, a testament to progress, where a ghost of the past is laid to rest forever, confined to the yellowed pages of ship's logs and forgotten medical texts. But history is rarely so neat, and ghosts have a habit of lingering. The great beast of the disease was not slain, merely starved. It was pushed back into the darkest corners of the world, into the shadows of our own modern making. And in those shadows it waits patiently, because the fundamental weakness it exploits, the simple metabolic inability of the human body to synthesize its own vitamin C, has not changed. We are all, every one of us, only ever a few weeks of profound neglect away from the same fate as a sailor on Vasco da Gama's fleet. The modern re-emergence of this affliction as a quiet epidemic. A story told not in the dramatic collapse of entire naval crews, but in the isolated case studies of medical journals and the hushed conversations of social workers. It is a disease of paradox. It appears in the wealthiest nations on earth. Nations where grocery stores overflow with an abundance of citrus fruits flown in from every corner of the globe, available year-round. It is a spectre haunting the land of plenty. It finds its victims not on the high seas, but in quiet apartments, in nursing homes, in the sprawling anonymous suburbs. The sea is no longer the wilderness. The new wilderness is a landscape of processed food, of what nutritionists grimly call food deserts. where fresh produce is a rare and expensive commodity. The new isolation is not the vastness of the Pacific, but the loneliness of old age, of poverty, of mental illness. Consider the modern patient. It is not a hardened mariner with weathered skin and a 1,000-yard stare. It might be an elderly widower in a small flat in London or Chicago, subsisting on what is easy and cheap: tea, toast, canned soup, biscuits. His wife, who managed the shopping and cooking, is gone. He is tired and his joints ache. He dismisses it as old age. His gums begin to feel tender, and he blames his ill-fitting dentures. Small bruises appear on his shins, dark flowers blooming on pale skin, and he cannot recall bumping into anything. He feels a profound lethargy, a weariness that sleep cannot cure. He is irritable. He is depressed. His doctor, trained to look for complex modern ailments, might test for heart disease, for diabetes, for cancer. This disease is a disease of history books, a diagnostic zebra. Who would think to look for it now? And yet the symptoms are identical. The slow internal unraveling is the same. The collagen is failing. The microscopic ropes holding his body together are fraying one by one. Or consider a university student thousands of miles from home, struggling with finances and the pressures of study. Their diet narrows, becoming a monotonous rotation of instant noodles, pizza, and energy drinks. A diet of beige. They develop anxiety, which is attributed to academic stress. Their hair becomes brittle. They notice strange corkscrew patterns in the fine hairs on their arms. They feel weak. The body is sending out the ancient signals of distress. But in a world saturated with information about 1,000 other conditions, the simple elemental cry for a single missing nutrient is lost in the noise. There are documented cases, astonishing in their simplicity, of individuals in developed nations presenting with full-blown disease, their affliction cured within days by the simple prescription of a glass of orange juice and a vitamin supplement. The cure is laughably simple, which only makes its persistence more tragic. The ghost of the disease also walks the halls of hospitals, a consequence of other modern struggles. It appears in patients with eating disorders like anorexia, whose restricted diets starve the body of essential nutrients. It is seen in individuals who have undergone bariatric surgery, where altered digestion can impair nutrient absorption. It haunts those with chronic alcoholism, where a diet of liquid calories displaces all nutritious food, and the alcohol itself interferes with the body's ability to use the little vitamin C it does receive. It even appears in some children with autism spectrum disorder, who may have extremely selective eating habits, sometimes refusing to eat any fruits or vegetables at all. In each case, the context is modern, but the biological reality is ancient. The body deprived of ascorbic acid begins to consume itself. The walls of the capillaries weaken, leading to bleeding under the skin, in the joints, and around the organs. Old wounds, even surgical scars from decades past, can mysteriously and terrifyingly reopen. As the scar tissue, a patchwork of collagen, dissolves from within, is a quiet internal collapse. And beyond the borders of the developed world, the disease is not a ghost, but a grim and recurring reality. In refugee camps, where millions are displaced by war and famine, nutrition is a constant battle of logistics. Supply chains are fragile. A delayed shipment of fortified food, a reliance on a monotonous diet of grain or rice without supplementation, can be enough for the old enemy to stir. A small outbreak in a camp in Kenya or a settlement on the border of Syria is a canary in the coal mine, a sign of a critical failure in the humanitarian safety net. It is a signal that the diet is dangerously incomplete, that other deficiency diseases, less dramatic in their initial presentation, are likely taking hold as well. The disease becomes a barometer of human suffering, its presence indicating a system under unbearable strain. It is a testament to the fact that for all our technological advancement, the simple biological needs of the human animal remain unchanged. We have built a world of incredible complexity, but we are still creatures who can be brought low by the absence of a single humble fruit. The terror of the sea has been replaced by the quiet desperation of circumstance. The enemy is the same, only the battlefield has changed. The long war against this insidious decay left more than just scientific breakthroughs and public health policies in its wake. It stained our very language, weaving itself into the fabric of our culture, leaving behind artifacts of speech and story like the scattered bones of a shipwreck on a distant shore. The memory of the disease echoes in the words we use, the tales we tell, and the very identity of nations. It is a legacy written in slang, in literature, and on the geopolitical map. Perhaps the most famous of these linguistic relics is the word limey. It is a term now used often with a hint of affectionate derision to refer to a person from Britain, but its origins are rooted in the complex, often clumsy naval logistics of the 19th century. We remember James Lind and his elegant experiment with lemons in 1747. We remember Gilbert Blaine and the Admiralty's final reluctant adoption of lemon juice in 1795. For a time, the Royal Navy had conquered the disease. Their fleets could remain at sea indefinitely, blockading Napoleon's ports, projecting power across the globe. They were masters of the sea, in large part because they were masters of nutrition. But then came a subtle, yet devastating shift in policy. In the mid-19th century, the British began to favour limes over lemons as their primary source of antiscorbutic. The logic seemed sound. The British Empire now had vast colonies in the West Indies like Jamaica and Dominica, where limes grew in abundance. Sourcing lemons primarily from Mediterranean countries like Spain and Italy was more expensive and politically complicated. Why buy from a potential rival when you could source from within your own imperial garden? So the switch was made. The Royal Navy, and later the British Merchant Marine, were supplied with the juice of the West Indian lime. It was a proud imperial solution. There was just one fatal problem, a problem no one at the time could have possibly understood. The West Indian lime citrus aurantifolia contains significantly less vitamin C than the Mediterranean lemon citrus limon. To be precise, it has about half. And to make matters worse, the process of preserving the juice in the 19th century, storing it in copper-lined casks, further degraded what little ascorbic acid was present. The result was a catastrophic failure of public health policy. British sailors, diligently taking their daily ration of lime juice, began to get the disease again. Outbreaks reappeared on long voyages. The cure had lost its power. Meanwhile, sailors in the burgeoning American Navy and merchant fleet, who were often still able to source lemons, or whose shorter routes required less stringent preservation, were healthier. They looked upon their British counterparts with their sallow skin and bleeding gums and noted their peculiar reliance on the inferior lime. And so the name was born, limey. It was not a compliment, it was an insult. A piece of dockside slang hurled across the water, meaning you poor sickly devil, you with your useless cure. It was a taunt that stuck, its sharp, scorbutic origins eventually forgotten, smoothed over by time into a simple, quirky nickname. But the cultural footprint of the disease extends far beyond a single piece of slang. It looms like a storm cloud in the background of our great maritime literature, an unspoken dread that shapes the narrative. In Herman Melville's Moby Dick, the crew of the Pequod is on a voyage that will last for years, a fanatical quest that pushes them far beyond the normal boundaries of whaling. While Melville doesn't dwell on the graphic details, the threat is ever present. The health of the crew is a constant simmering concern. He writes of how a whaling ship after a long cruise becomes a floating hospital, a place of languor and death. The true monster of the voyage is not just the white whale, but the internal decay that threatens every man aboard. The quest for whale oil, the fuel of the 19th century, was always a race against the body's own dwindling internal resources. Consider Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. The pirate crew marooned on the island begins to fall ill. Stevenson describes one of them shaking and burning with fever, but another character diagnoses the true problem with a chilling certainty. That man's gone crazy mad, he says. But if you want to know what killed him, well, it was the rum and the climate and the long watch. I reckon that would have sent a better man to his last account. It's a veiled reference. The long watch meant a long time at sea, a long time without fresh food. The pirates, for all their ferocity and greed, were ultimately just as vulnerable as any naval sailor to the slow, creeping rot of the disease. The disease becomes a force of nature, an agent of justice, thinning the ranks of the wicked, as surely as a volley of musket fire. It adds a layer of grim realism to these tales of adventure, a reminder that the greatest danger on the high seas was often not cannonballs or krakens, but a simple lack of fruit. This constant battle against nutritional deficiency profoundly shaped the course of empire. The nation that could keep its sailors healthy was the nation that could rule the waves. For a crucial period from the late 18th to the mid-19th century, that nation was Britain. The successful implementation of lemon juice rationing gave the Royal Navy a staggering strategic advantage. Their ships could maintain long, arduous blockades of enemy ports for months, even years on end. The French fleet under Napoleon was trapped in harbours like Brest and Toulon. Their sailors confined to port or making short, desperate sorties suffered from the diseases of inactivity and poor sanitation, while the British crews patrolling offshore were for the most part robust and healthy. This naval superiority, underwritten by vitamin C, was a key factor in Napoleon's ultimate defeat. It allowed Britain to control the world's sea lanes, protecting its own trade while strangling that of its enemies. The ability to undertake ever longer voyages also fueled the final great age of exploration. Captain James Cook's epic voyages across the Pacific were triumphs of navigation and science, but they were above all triumphs of logistics and public health. Cook was obsessed with the health of his crew. While he mistakenly attributed the prevention of the disease to a variety of factors, including portable soup and malt, his insistence on cleanliness and crucially on forcing his men to eat fresh greens and sauerkraut whenever possible, meant he lost remarkably few men to the disease. His success allowed him to map vast unknown territories from Australia to the Hawaiian Islands, from the Antarctic Circle to the coast of Alaska. He and his men were able to stay at sea for years at a time, charting the world because they had found a way to hold the internal collapse at bay. The disease, therefore, did not just influence the health of sailors. It drew the very lines on the maps we use today. The conquest of the disease was inseparable from the conquest of the globe. It was the secret ingredient of empire, the invisible hand that guided the fates of fleets and the destinies of nations. And so we arrive at the end of our long and winding voyage. We have sailed from the shores of ancient Egypt through the age of discovery into the meticulous world of the 18th century naval surgeon, and finally into the quiet modern corners where the ghost of this disease still lingers. Our story has been one of profound suffering, of ignorance, and of the slow, painful dawn of understanding. It is the story of how humanity finally solved one of its most ancient and devastating afflictions, and in doing so unlocked the planet. The final conquest was not a single, heroic act, but a gradual piecing together of a puzzle over centuries of victory, won in the laboratory as much as on the quarterdeck. It is the story of conquering a cellular collapse, the turning point, the moment the tide truly began to shift in this long war. Was not a battle at sea, but a quiet, methodical experiment conducted in the damp, cramped confines of a British man-of-war. The year was 1747. The ship was HMS Salisbury, patrolling the English Channel. The man was James Lind, a Scottish naval surgeon's mate. He was a man possessed of a keen sense of observation, and more importantly, a revolutionary idea for how to find answers amidst the noise of quackery and tradition. He had seen enough men die. He had seen the uselessness of the established cures. He decided to conduct a test. He found 12 sailors suffering from the disease, all with the same putrid gums, the same dark spots, the same profound weakness. He housed them in the same part of the ship, the sick bay, and gave them all the same basic diet. Then he divided them into 6 pairs. This simple act of creating a control group and comparative treatment arms was an act of genius. It was in essence the birth of the modern clinical trial. To the first pair, he gave a quart of cider a day. The second received 25 drops of elixir of vitriol sulfuric acid 3 times daily. The third pair was given 2 spoonfuls of vinegar. The fourth was prescribed a half pint of seawater. The fifth was given a medicinal paste containing garlic, mustard seed, and other herbs. And the final pair, lucky number 6, was given 2 oranges and 1 lemon each day. The results were, in Lind's own understated words, the most sudden and visible good effects. Within 6 days, the 2 sailors eating the citrus fruit were well enough to be returned to duty, helping to care for the others. The sailor on cider showed some slight improvement, but everyone else continued their slow, miserable decline. The evidence was undeniable. It was clear, simple, and elegant. The cure for the disease was citrus fruit. Yet, as we have seen, this stunning discovery was not the end of the story. It took another 48 years for the British Admiralty, an institution famously resistant to change, to make lemon juice a standard issue. Lind's discovery was hampered by the inertia of bureaucracy and the confusing medical theories of the day. Even Lind himself did not fully grasp the implications of his own experiment, believing that the fruits worked by cleansing the body rather than by supplying a missing nutrient. But the seed of a new way of thinking had been planted. The idea that a disease could be studied and a cure proven through a fair controlled test was a radical departure from a medicine based on balancing humours and speculative theories. The quest to conquer the disease did not just save sailors. It gave birth to the very methodology of evidence-based medicine that is the foundation of every medical treatment we rely on today. The final piece of the puzzle, the true why behind the cure, would have to wait for the 20th century and the birth of a new science, biochemistry. The hero of this final chapter is not a sailor or a surgeon, but a Hungarian scientist named Albert Szent-Györgyi. In the late 20s and early 1930s, working first at Cambridge and then in his native Hungary, Szent-Györgyi was studying cellular respiration, the process by which cells convert nutrients into energy. He managed to isolate a mysterious substance from adrenal glands and from plants like cabbage and paprika peppers. He found it was a powerful reducing agent, meaning it readily donated electrons, and he initially named it hexuronic acid. He suspected it had something to do with the prevention of the disease, but he couldn't prove it. The breakthrough came when he sent a sample to a British chemist, Walter Norman Haworth, who worked out its chemical structure. Together they renamed it. They called it ascorbic acid, which literally means the acid that prevents the disease. For the first time, the antiscorbutic principle was no longer a vague concept or a magical property of a fruit. It was a specific identifiable molecule, C6H806. The mystery was finally completely solved. It wasn't about the acidity of the fruit or its cleansing properties. It was about this one specific chemical compound that most mammals can produce in their own livers, but which humans, along with other primates and guinea pigs, had lost the ability to synthesize through a distant genetic mutation. This single ancient failing in our DNA was the vulnerability that the disease had exploited for millennia. With the isolation and later the artificial synthesis of vitamin C, the cure was no longer dependent on fragile supply chains of lemons or limes. It could be produced in a factory, put into a stable pill, and distributed anywhere in the world. It could be added to flour, to milk, to juice, fortifying the food supply of entire nations. The beast had not only been tamed, its very essence had been captured and understood. The story of this affliction is more than the history of a single disease. It is a profound parable about human progress. It is a story about how we learn to see. We learn to see the subtle connection between a sailor's diet and his health. We learn to see the value of a controlled experiment to separate truth from assumption. We learn to see the invisible world of molecules and to understand that our bodies are intricate chemical engines with specific, non-negotiable needs. The conquest of this one disease revolutionized nutrition, founded the science of the clinical trial, and transformed naval strategy, enabling the final mapping and colonization of the globe. It turned the world's oceans from vast, terrifying graveyards into highways for commerce and exploration. It is a story that reminds us that our greatest triumphs often begin with a simple observation, with the courage to question tradition, and with the humble recognition that sometimes the cure for a world of suffering can be found in a single piece of fruit. The internal collapse was finally understood, and in that understanding, we found not just a cure, but a new way of navigating the world.